Thank you, Holling. And thanks to all the young men that get up here and make an effort to speak. Takes a lot of courage to get up here, even at 50 plus. It takes a lot of courage to get up here. And so I appreciate all that they do and the thoughts that they bring and the time that they put into that study. It's very good. If I can get going here. Well, we've come to the first official Wednesday night study of the study of the book of Exodus. We've had about a month's worth of introductions into that, and I didn't want to disappoint, so we're going to have another introduction, basically. We'll have an introduction into the first 6 chapters. As we got together back in July and kind of broke this up, and Jonathan spent a lot of time doing that, and we got together and divided up into teams and groups, and I was a little mortified when I found that we were the first group and the first group to go, but luckily we've got a lot of good guys on the team, and I think we're going to have some really good and really interesting lessons coming up over the next 5 weeks. We'll exclude this week. This may not be terribly interesting or good, but so I wanted to tonight, we're going to do a little bit different, but really kind of just introduce the subject a little bit. We'll talk about the lessons that we're going to have over the next, I guess it's actually 6 weeks, but the next 5 lessons that we have in the book of Exodus. And so on our team, you can tell we've got 11 members of that team, and we had 6 slots. So you can imagine that we've got a few people that won't be up here, but we were able to get together enough people, and I don't think anybody was voluntold. We had some volun-asks, I guess, but everybody stepped up to the plate, and we've got our next 5 lessons kind of all lined out. But we've had a good time. Like I said, we met back in July as a big group, and then this team has met a couple times over the past month or so, got together on an evening and been able to kind of just walk through these first 6 chapters of the book of Exodus. We had some really good dialogue and discussion of those first 6 chapters. And thanks to Steve, and Steve's done a lot of work in this as well. We kind of came up with some ways to divide this first 6 chapters up. At the very first and the very surface, it seems pretty easy. We got 6 chapters, we got 6 spots. We'll just do a chapter at a time. But talking to Steve, and we spent some time looking at it, so we thought we'd do it a little bit differently rather than just doing a chapter study each evening. Kind of break it up and maybe pick some of the more potent points of these 6 chapters and bring those to lessons. And so next week, Brother Billy Bob is going to come and bring a lesson to us about the relationship of Moses and God. You know, he's got a pretty daunting task in front of him, but he's really going to set the stage for us on getting to know Moses and the relationship of Moses with God. You know, in these first 6 chapters, we see some details of that relationship. We see some times when God was not very happy with Moses. In verse 14, in verse 14, there in chapter 4, it says that the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses. And just in 10 small verses, or 10 small verses later, we see God looking to maybe take Moses' life. So there's a lot in that relationship between Moses and God, and so Billy Bob is going to bring and kind of set the stage for us to really get to know Moses and to understand maybe a little bit deeper that relationship that Moses had with God. And then following up that, the next week, Tripp's going to talk about the excuses of Moses, assuming he's still awake at that point. He's pretty tired right now, but we're going to talk about the excuses of Moses. And, you know, as those are chronicled in the book of Exodus there, we see Moses acting a lot like we do. He tried to give reasons. He tried to give excuses of why not to be the person chosen, why not to be the one that could do that. And if we look at that real closely, we can see us in those excuses. And I love reading through those excuses because it comes down to everything. And at the very end, Moses just says, just send somebody else. I've got all these reasons why I can't do it, but the real reason is I just don't want to do it. And so Tripp's going to spend some time and bring some thoughts to us around those excuses. And then we'll have, the next week will be Singing Week, and so beginning in October, that second Wednesday in October, our brother Kevin's going to bring us a lesson around that trip back to Egypt. Several very interesting things happened to Moses on his way back to Egypt. And Kevin's going to dive into those events. And one of those events that happened, we already talked about a little bit earlier, where Moses God was apt to kill Moses. He was intending to kill him, looked to kill him. That happened on the way back to Egypt. Another interesting detail of that, Kevin's going to unpack a lot of those for us. So we look forward to that lesson from Kevin in October. Then we're going to follow that up the next week with a lesson from Steve. He's going to bring us about moral dilemma. Interestingly enough, it's going to dovetail very well with what Brother Dale spoke on Saturday, I believe, or Sunday, I'm sorry. Again, talking about some of the things that we find in these first 6 chapters of people with moral dilemmas. The birthmaids that had that choice, and Pharaoh told them when those Hebrew women get up on there and get ready to give birth, take that baby and kill it. And we know that they didn't. They had that moral dilemma of what to do. And so Steve's going to dive into that and talk about that a little bit more, and talk about some other things in these 6 verses that really have to do with some of the exact same things we deal with today. And then lastly, we will finish up at the end of October with Ryan Ferguson giving us a lesson. We've kind of titled the topic, Don't Ever Give Up. But if you kind of go through this story and you think about Moses' encounter with the people and what Moses was going through and what he did, when he first went back to the children of Israel there and told them what he was doing, in chapter 4, verse 31, it says, and the people believed. And you can imagine, or I can imagine, or I put myself in Moses' spot after delivering this message to him, telling him who he had spoke to and what he was getting ready to do and the signs and those things. And the people believed and they were ready. And then they go talk to Pharaoh. And we know what Pharaoh does. Pharaoh kind of doubles down on the punishment, or not punishment, doubles down on their work. And the people get distraught. And they get upset. We think about that time when Moses and Aaron met with the foreman there, and the words that they used were, "You make us stink in the eyes of Pharaoh." So all of a sudden Moses is gone from this superhero, if you will, this guy that's going to lead him out and lead him to the promised land, to, you're the guy that's making this worse for us. And Moses just, I can imagine his countenance falls. And we see some of that interaction with God there. But Ryan will take us through that and walk through that and give us a little bit more detail and let us dive into that a little deeper. So I thought for the rest of the time this evening, for the last few minutes that we have here, we'll kind of go through those first 6 chapters, kind of highlight some things, and then we'll finish up with some of the typology that we find in at least the first chapter of the book of Exodus. As we left that meeting in July, middle of July, and realized we had the first 6 chapters, I remembered what Mike said about his lessons and how he studies and reads and reads and reads and reads. And it's probably no revelation to anyone here that I don't like to read that much. And so I got in my car and I started listening to it. And so I listened to it over and over and over and listened to it several times between then and now. But what I realized the first time I listened through it was there's an awful lot contained in these first 6 chapters, an awful lot that sets the stage for the remaining parts of Exodus. I mean, it really sets the stage. A lot of the more well-known biblical events happen in these first 6 chapters. When you think about the burning bush, things that the world is very familiar with, a lot of huge events happen in these first 6 chapters. And the first chapter really, if you were to title it, would be the darkness before dawn. You know, the chapter starts out and tells us about the people that came with Jacob, his family that came into Egypt. We remember the story that ended in Genesis with Joseph bringing his family into Egypt, and everything is great. and that's kind of how we're left. Well, as we pick up here in Exodus, we find that 70 of them came, 70 members of that family came, and now they're multiplying, and they're growing, and they're prospering inside this land, and they become a large number of people in the land of Egypt. And I never really found a great way to use this as an illustration, but I find it interesting as we read through there. It said, and Joseph died, and the Pharaoh died. The Pharaoh that had given him favor died, and time goes on, and people forget. And I think one thing that I can learn from that is you can never rest on what your forefathers did. We've got to be busy about our work. But for the children of Israel, as they multiply and prosper, and the pharaohs die, and new ones come in, and new kings, new pharaohs come in, he looked around and didn't see them as a blessing. He didn't know who Joseph was. He didn't care who Joseph was. He saw a people that were getting so strong and so large and powerful that he was afraid they could join with his enemies and overthrow him. And so he attempts to stop this. And we know the story. He gets the midwives to go and say, anytime there's a Hebrew boy born, you take him and kill him. And we know that they didn't, but that wasn't good enough for Pharaoh. That didn't work. Then he tells everybody, hey, if you see a Hebrew boy born, you take him and you throw him in the Nile River. Pharaoh's going to do everything he can to stop. This is really that darkness. It's pretty bleak for the children of Israel right now. We've got a Pharaoh that's doing everything he can to make sure he keeps us in our place. Everything he can do to keep his thumb on us. And that's how the first chapter ends, is with that decree from Pharaoh saying, if you see a Hebrew child being born, you throw it into the river. So it's a pretty dark ending. And we start chapter 2 with the Redeemer. The Redeemer is born. Moses, the Redeemer. We know the story. We read it. Holling read it this evening. But Moses there grows up in the house of Pharaoh. And I found something interesting, or one of the things I found interesting in this little book, or this little section of Exodus in chapter 2. And in chapter 2 and verse 2, it says, the woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. So I always look at things and I read it and I'm like, well, what if she hadn't seen that he was a fine child? And so what does that mean? If he wasn't a fine child, would he have been thrown in the river? Would he have perished like other young Hebrew males did? So in order to kind of answer these questions like that, we can look over in the book of Hebrews. He helps explain this a little bit. In Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 23, listen to what the writer there says. It says, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents, because they saw that the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. We see here, if I can read that appropriately, what they did by faith. What the parents chose to do there was a great example of faith. But even that, the writer of Hebrews still acts like there's this word beautiful is in there, and it makes you wonder kind of what would have happened. But look over back into Acts. And Stephen there in his sermon in Acts chapter 7 and verse 20, it says, at this time Moses was born, and he was beautiful in God's sight. And he was brought up for 3 months in his father's house. So I think if we can tie all those three things together, we learn a little bit about Moses, and we learn a little bit about his parents, the faith that they had, and what God saw in Moses and God had laid out for Moses to be. The beauty that they saw in Moses was not an external beauty, but an internal beauty. They understood that their child was special. So really, as you read that, it's not really that they looked at their child and he was pretty or beautiful or perfect or whatever, because I could imagine most parents would do that. I can promise you every grandparent does that. But what they saw was what the beauty inside that God saw in him. Something special about Moses. So in chapter 2, after that, obviously Pharaoh grows up in the house of Pharaoh. We know that he kills an Egyptian, and we know that he flees to Midian. So that's kind of how chapter 2 goes through. So we see now, as we get into chapter 3, Moses in Midian. He's taken his wife. And we find him being aware. Now Moses is being aware of God's plan. When Moses saw the burning bush, God told him to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. Moses asked God his name during this interaction. And God replied with, "I am who I am." And so let's think about a few of the New Testament implications of that statement, "I am who I am." The meaning for the name of God in the New Testament is staggering and will mean much to us in our walk with God. There are at least 3 important places where "I am" is a powerful declaration to the New Testament people of God. Listen to how God describes himself as the book of Revelation opens. "I am the Alpha and the Omega," says the Lord God, "who is and who was and who is to come, the Almighty." That's in Revelation 1, verse 8. Notice how this same message, the "I am," means that God is, God was, and God continues to be. God's ever present and always will be with his people. God being eternal is for our good, for he always knows our condition and he's always with us. Consider what God said, consider what God said he was doing when he revealed himself as the "I am." God said he was coming down to rescue his people from Pharaoh with many wonders. You know, the whole book of Exodus is a picture book showing us how God will save his people. Think about Jesus' words as he comes to Israel to teach them who he is and what he's come to do. In the book of John, Jesus says there, "Your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw it and was glad." So the Jews said to him, "You are not yet 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham?" Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." Earlier to that same audience, Jesus said, "I told you that you would die in your sins, for unless you believe that I am he, you will die in your sins." Notice that same connection that God, as the "I am," means salvation for those who turn to him, because there's no other God and no other Savior. Jesus took the majesty and hope of the name of the Lord and placed it on himself as the answer for the world. God saw our sinful condition, was moved with compassion, and has come down to rescue us. This is why Jesus says that when you see him, see Jesus, you're able to see God. What a comforting thought to know that our God is, was, and will be. Chapter 4, titled that, The Redeemer is Assured. You know, he's given signs. I learned after listening to this, at the thought of Moses and I have something in common. And when God was giving him these signs, it hit me as I was listening. As God was giving Moses these signs, he told him his staff, and he said, throw it down, and it became a serpent. He said Moses ran. He was scared of snakes. And I think about that, and I wonder what what that really means, if it means anything other than Moses was scared. But I can understand that. I can understand that fear of you throwing down your staff and it turns into a snake. I'd probably run too. And he told him to pick it up. Anyway, God gives him some signs there. He talks about his leprous hand that he sticks in his cloak and it turns leprous, and he puts it back and it becomes white. Talking to him, it gave him the opportunity to turn water to wine. This is some of the result of some of the excuses that Moses had, but God's preparing Moses to be able to lead his people. God's preparing Moses to be a strong leader, one that the people will look up to and follow. We know that in his excuses, Aaron said, well, I can't speak. And God said, okay, I'll give you Aaron. So he had Aaron to help him and be his helper in this endeavor and venture. When I think of chapter 4 and the signs that God allowed Moses to have, I think about the things that Moses needed to do to make those happen. And I think about the things that he's given us to know. When I think about his creation and all the things that he's given us, the signs that he's given us of the things that we know and can know. But he's preparing Moses for this journey. Then we roll into chapter 5, and we see that first interaction that Moses has with Pharaoh. And we find, we've talked about it a little bit already, that Pharaoh took that, assumed because they wanted to go worship their God, that they were just idle. They had too much time. And so he takes and adds to their burden and tells them, you know, used to we'd bring you straw to put in your bricks, but now you're going to have to go get your own straw, make your bricks, and by the way, you're still going to have to produce as many bricks tomorrow as you did today. So the burdens are increased. Everything is not looking very good as we end chapter 5. And then in chapter 6, we find here God reaffirms the plan for Moses. He tells him again exactly what he's going to do, how he's going to do it, the things that will happen. As we talked about this last week, the group got together and we talked about it. You know, we get to go right up to the good stuff. Right when the plagues start happening, our chapters end. So we don't get to talk about that much. But the affirmation that he gives Moses here in chapter 6 helps propel Moses to do the things that he needed to do. And then lastly, and we discussed this quite a bit in our group, is this genealogy is given of Moses. It seems to be an interesting place for it to be put right at the end of chapter 6 after we've kind of got the story of Moses. And there's a lot of different thoughts on why that is, why it's placed between this contest, as the contest is getting ready to begin between Pharaoh and God. And as we know, it's not much of a contest, but this genealogy is placed right there at the beginning. And I think maybe after reading some and looking through some, I think this really is kind of the first 5 chapters plus is kind of the prologue to Moses. We're introduced to him, we see where he is, but now we get the genealogy. And then starting in chapter 7, we see the true events that are going to take place, the plagues that come. And Moses' really his start is right there at the end of chapter 6 and beginning of verse 7. So those are kind of some of the highlights through those first 6 chapters. And I wanted to just take a few things that we probably talked about them through the introduction over the last month, and this typology and how we see the types of things in Exodus and how they relate to us today. And the first one is this typology of Christ, and that's Moses, right? We've talked about this, the Exodus events and God, is really God's picture book of redemption and deliverance. When we read the book, we're learning about what God would do later through Christ and for his people. As we study this book, we're going to continue to have this lens as we study it, this lens of moving forward and what Christ is going to do for us. And I think as we think about Christ, I just want to take a couple real quick parallels between the life of Moses and the life of Christ. In Matthew chapter 2 and verse 16, this first fulfillment we see there, it says, "Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men." So we see here a leader trying to snuff out Jesus, if you will, by killing all the young men. It's exactly what we see in Moses as Pharaoh trying to make sure he snuffs out that people by killing all the young men. Very, very similar and very indicative of what we saw in the life of Christ. And secondly, in there in Matthew, beginning at verse 13, it says, I'm going to have to turn around. "Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, 'Rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him.' And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, 'Out of Egypt I called my son.'" There's an awful lot of verbiage in those first 6 chapters about his son, God's son, Israel, the people of Israel. And it's very similar how God called Christ up out of Egypt, and he's calling his children out of Egypt. We talked about earlier the time of darkness. But even in that time of darkness, God had a plan. The other typology we would look at is the typology of the church. And again, I apologize, that's maybe a little small. But I couldn't help but think of when I read through this, when Pharaoh did those things to the children of Israel, and all they did was multiply, and they were scattered about throughout the land of Egypt. It reminded me here of this account of the church, the early church. It says, "And Saul approved of his execution. And there arose on that day a great persecution against the church in Jerusalem. And they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. Devout men buried Stephen and made great lamentation over him. But Saul was ravaging the church, and entering house after house, he dragged off men and women and committed them to prison. Now those who were scattered went about preaching the word. Philip went down to the city of Samaria and proclaimed to them the Christ. And the crowds with one accord paid attention to what was being said by Philip when they heard him and saw the signs that he did. For unclean spirits crying out with a loud voice came out of many who had them, and many who were paralyzed or lame were healed. So there was much joy in that city." The persecution of the church Satan's way to kill the church did nothing but increase it and grow it. Pharaoh's attempt to squash and squelch the children of Israel did nothing but help them grow and continue to grow. It's very similar to what we see with the church. And then lastly, the last thing I will leave you with is we see hope. And specifically at the end of these 6 chapters, we see a lot of hope. In the midst of suffering and seemingly hopeless situations, God is working. While the command is for the Hebrew boys to be thrown into a river, a seemingly hopeless situation, being surrounded by death, God is working to save his people. God was not far away. God was already moving pieces in place to save his people. When the women are at the foot of the cross of Jesus, as he hangs on that cross in his death, the feeling of despair and doubt overwhelms his followers. We know that God was not far away. God was moving pieces in place to save his people. We have hope in suffering and difficulties, for we see that God is working and moving pieces. Maybe pieces in places that we can't see or can't understand, but we have that hope. The Hebrews could not have known what was going on as their baby boys were being thrown into the river day after day. But God was at work and preparing to rescue. When things of this earth and this world and this life get us down and it seems dark and despair and gloomy, we need to remember to have hope. We need to remember that our God sees, knows, cares, remembers, and loves us. That's the hope we have. That's our thoughts of the evening. I hope you're as excited about this study as we are. I know our team's pretty excited. We're going to be looking forward to the next couple months that we'll get to be up here and be teaching. If you're in the audience this evening and you've lost that hope, and it's easy to do with the things that are around us and the challenges that we have, but if you've lost that hope and you are looking for a way to get it back, or you need some other avenue that we can help with prayer, we would be happy to do that and pray with you at this time. If there is one in the audience this evening that has not obeyed God's plan of salvation and wants to understand that hope, wants to be circumcised with that baptism, now's the best time to do it. We'll find a way. We'll get you baptized tonight if that's your desire. So if there be one in either case or either situation that needs the prayers or needs the help of the church, if you would let yourself known as we stand and sing the song.